7:42 a.m., late autumn, 1978. The regional train moved with regulated precision along a corridor defined as routine by every administrative measure that governed it. Its schedule had not shifted in months. Its passenger load fell within predictable margins. Even the sequence of stops, industrial outskirts, secondary towns, and one restricted transit junction, followed a pattern so consistent that deviations, when they occurred, were almost always mechanical rather than human. Within this controlled environment, the process of ticket inspection was not merely a task, but a calibrated procedure designed to preserve order across thousands of daily movements. The ticket inspector assigned to this route operated within that system, without distinction. His position did not grant authority beyond verification, nor did it require interpretation beyond established guidelines. His responsibility was simple in definition, but exacting in execution. Validate each passenger's authorization to occupy a seat within a moving jurisdiction. Over time, repetition had refined his attention into something more precise than routine awareness. He did not look at tickets as documents alone, but as objects shaped by systems, machines, stations, and habits that left behind measurable traces. Each shift began before the train reached operational speed. He boarded at a fixed point, entered the first carriage, and moved forward in a consistent progression. The order never changed. Rows were scanned in sequence, tickets collected, examined, and marked where necessary. Hands moved with efficiency, but the eyes lingered just long enough to register irregularities that might escape an untrained observer. Dates were confirmed, routes aligned, and most importantly, punch marks verified. These small perforations, produced by station-specific devices, acted as silent indicators of origin and validation. To most passengers, they were insignificant. To the inspector, they were the most reliable form of authentication. The environment in which this process unfolded rarely demanded deviation. Passengers behaved within expected norms. Commuters presented worn tickets, folded along habitual lines. Laborers carried passes stamped repeatedly over weeks of use. Occasional travelers introduced minor variation, but even these deviations followed predictable patterns. The system, by design, absorbed irregularity without disruption. It was built to function continuously, without drawing attention to itself. On that morning, nothing outwardly disrupted this structure. The train advanced on schedule. The compartments maintained their quiet rhythm. The inspector progressed through the carriages with the same measured pace that had defined his work for years. It was within this repetition that the first deviation appeared, not as an interruption, but as a detail that did not fully align with the surrounding consistency. The ticket itself was presented without hesitation. Its printed information corresponded to a valid route. The date matched the day's schedule. At a glance, there was no reason to pause. Yet the punch mark, positioned near the upper edge, carried a subtle inconsistency. Its alignment was fractionally offset from the standard placement used by the issuing station. The deviation was small enough to be dismissed as mechanical variance. Punch devices, though standardized, were subject to wear. Slight misalignments were not unknown. The inspector did not stop the process. The ticket was returned, and the sequence continued uninterrupted. No notation was made. No question was raised. Within the framework of his duties, the anomaly did not meet the threshold required for intervention. It existed only as an observation, stored alongside countless others that never developed into actionable concerns. As the train moved forward, the inspection proceeded without further irregularity. Each carriage mirrored the one before it. Tickets aligned with expectations. Punch marks corresponded to known station devices. The system reaffirmed itself through repetition. By the time the final compartment was cleared, the earlier inconsistency had receded into the background of accumulated detail. The inspector completed his route and disembarked at the scheduled terminus. Documentation was filed in accordance with procedure. Any notable incidents would have been recorded formally, but none met the criteria for entry. The day closed as it had begun, within the parameters of normal operation. In the days that followed, the same route continued under identical conditions. Weather shifted slightly, affecting passenger volume, but not the structure of movement. The inspector resumed his position each morning, repeating the sequence that defined his role. Each ticket passed through the same process of verification. Each punch mark was assessed within the same framework of recognition. It was not until several days later that the earlier observation resurfaced. The reappearance did not occur immediately, nor did it present itself in an identical form. Instead, it emerged through accumulation, a gradual alignment of details that, taken individually, remained insignificant. Another ticket displayed a similar inconsistency. The punch mark again deviated slightly from expected positioning. The difference was minimal, but it echoed the earlier observation closely enough to be recognized. The inspector registered the similarity without altering his behavior. The process continued uninterrupted. The ticket was accepted, and the passenger moved on. At this stage, the anomaly remained within the boundaries of coincidence. Mechanical variation could account for minor inconsistencies. Stations operated under varying conditions. Devices were maintained at different intervals. There was no procedural basis to connect the two occurrences beyond superficial resemblance. Yet the inspector's experience did not rely solely on isolated evaluation. Years of repetition had established an internal reference system, a mental catalog of patterns that extended beyond formal guidelines. Within that system, repetition carried weight. Even subtle similarities, when observed more than once, began to form connections that warranted attention, if only internally. The route itself provided a stable environment for such recognition. Unlike long-distance trains with fluctuating passenger profiles, this corridor maintained a consistent flow of individuals. Regular commuters occupied the same seats. Their tickets exhibited predictable wear patterns. Even occasional travelers adhered to recognizable behaviors. This consistency created a baseline against which anomalies, however small, became more visible over time. The inspector's awareness began to adjust accordingly. Without deviating from procedure, he allowed his observations to extend slightly beyond immediate verification. Tickets were still processed at the same pace, but attention lingered fractionally longer on details that might otherwise be dismissed. Punch marks were not only checked for presence, but for origin consistency. Paper quality was noted alongside printed information. These adjustments remained internal, invisible to passengers and unrecorded in official logs. Despite this subtle shift, no immediate pattern emerged. Days passed without repetition of the earlier anomaly. The system reasserted its normalcy. The inspector continued his routine, maintaining the balance between efficiency and observation that defined his role. The absence of further irregularities might have resolved the earlier observations as incidental, but the structure of the work did not allow for complete dismissal. The inspector did not actively search for discrepancies, yet he remained receptive to their reappearance. The process itself encouraged this state, an ongoing calibration between expectation and observation. By the end of the week, the route had maintained its consistency. Passenger flow remained stable. Ticket validation proceeded without interruption. The earlier inconsistencies had not developed into a discernible pattern. They existed only as isolated entries within the inspector's internal record. The section closes not with resolution, but with a return to the system's equilibrium. The train continues its scheduled movement. The inspector resumes his position within it, unchanged in function but subtly altered in awareness. The anomaly has not yet become a problem. It has not disrupted the system. It remains, at this stage, a detail, small, unrecorded, and unresolved, waiting within a repetition of routine for confirmation or disappearance. The route maintained its disciplined continuity into early winter, with schedules holding firm despite shorter daylight hours and increased passenger density during morning and evening intervals. Within this stability, the inspector's observational focus, once diffuse and passive, began to narrow to a specific pattern that could no longer be categorized as incidental. The earlier inconsistencies, minor deviations in punch alignment, reappeared with enough frequency to establish repetition, though still spaced irregularly across multiple days. Each occurrence was separated by gaps sufficient to avoid immediate detection within formal oversight, yet close enough to remain present within the inspector's internal record. The passenger associated with these tickets did not present as distinctive in any conventional sense. Clothing, posture, and movement remained within expected norms for the route. There was no visible attempt to conceal identity, nor any behavioral deviation that would typically draw attention during inspection. What distinguished this individual was not appearance, but timing. Appearances were confined to a narrow operational window, typically between 7:30 and 8:10 a.m., and never occurred on consecutive days. This spacing created an irregular rhythm that resisted easy classification, while still forming a pattern when observed across a longer timeline. The inspector began aligning these appearances against memory rather than documentation. Dates were retained mentally, along with approximate boarding positions and carriage selection. The passenger consistently occupied mid-train compartments, avoiding both the first and last carriages where inspection timing was most predictable. This positioning introduced a variable that allowed for slight adjustments in movement without disrupting the broader routine. It suggested an awareness of process, though not necessarily a surveillance. Ticket examination continued to provide the most consistent point of deviation. Each time the passenger appeared, the ticket presented was valid in its printed details. Route designation, date, and fare class all aligned with official issuance. However, the punch mark, though present and correctly placed within the designated area, exhibited a recurring inconsistency in origin. The indentation pattern did not correspond precisely with any single station device known along the route. Instead, it appeared as a hybrid impression, subtly altered in depth and angle, as though produced under controlled but non-standard conditions. At first, this discrepancy remained within the boundaries of mechanical explanation. Punch devices were subject to wear, and minor variations could occur between stations with similar equipment. However, the repetition of the same irregular characteristics across multiple tickets suggested a level of consistency that mechanical degradation alone could not account for. The marks were not random. They followed a pattern of deviation that implied replication rather than deterioration. The inspector did not escalate the matter through formal channels at this stage. The evidence, while suggestive, lacked the specificity required for procedural reporting. Instead, he adjusted his observational method. Movement through the train remained consistent in outward form, but internal pacing shifted slightly to allow for more deliberate examination when the passenger was present. Tickets were held marginally longer. Angles of inspection altered to catch variations in light, and tactile assessment. Pressure, thickness, and resistance was applied more consciously. These adjustments were subtle enough to remain undetected within the broader flow of inspection. Passengers experienced no delay significant enough to register as unusual. The system continued to function without interruption. Yet within this continuity, the inspector's role had begun to shift from passive verification to active observation, though still confined within the limits of his authority. Environmental factors contributed to the growing clarity of the pattern. The route passed through several stations undergoing temporary operational changes, maintenance closures, reduced staffing, and altered service hours. These variations were documented and communicated through internal bulletins, providing a reference framework for expected ticket origins. It was within this context that a critical inconsistency emerged. On a morning marked by reduced service at one of the intermediate stations, the passenger presented a ticket bearing a punch mark attributed to that very location. According to official records, the station's validation device had been offline for several days due to maintenance. No tickets issued during that period should have carried its distinctive punch signature. The presence of such a mark, even in altered form, introduced a contradiction that could not be reconciled through routine explanation. The inspector registered this discrepancy immediately, though his outward response remained unchanged. The ticket was returned without comment. The sequence of inspection continued. No interruption was introduced into the system. However, the internal threshold for concern had been crossed. The anomaly was no longer a matter of pattern recognition alone. It now conflicted directly with verified operational data. From this point, observation became more structured. The inspector began correlating appearances not only with memory but with external factors, station activity, schedule deviations, and passenger flow variations. Each occurrence was placed within a broader operational context, allowing for more precise identification of inconsistencies. The passengers' movements, while still limited in frequency, began to form a clearer trajectory. Boarding points varied, but within a defined segment of the route. Exits remained consistent, occurring within a corridor that connected to multiple secondary transit options. This pattern suggested intentional variability at the point of entry, combined with stability at the point of exit. Such behavior did not disrupt the system, but indicated a level of planning beyond casual travel. The inspector's awareness extended to timing within the inspection sequence. By adjusting his progression slightly, accelerating through earlier compartments or delaying entry into mid-train sections, he was able to observe the passenger's behavior before and after ticket validation. These observations remained limited but informative. The passenger did not display signs of anxiety or urgency. Movements were measured, interactions minimal, and attention directed outward rather than toward the inspection process. This composure, combined with the recurring ticket anomalies, reinforced the emerging conflict. The irregularities were not accompanied by behavioral indicators typically associated with evasion or deception. Instead, they existed within a controlled presentation that suggested familiarity with the system's expectations. The absence of visible tension did not reduce suspicion. It redirected it toward method rather than motive. Days continued to pass without formal escalation. The inspector maintained his position within the system, balancing routine execution with heightened awareness. Each appearance of the passenger added another data point to the developing pattern. Each ticket reinforced the consistency of the anomaly. The system, designed to absorb minor deviations, now contained repetition that resisted normalization. The turning point within this phase did not occur through confrontation, but through accumulation reaching a level that demanded action. The inspector recognized that further observation alone would not resolve the inconsistency. The pattern had stabilized sufficiently to suggest intentional design. At the same time, the absence of overt violation limited the scope of permissible response within his role. To address this constraint, the inspector began forming a controlled approach that would allow for closer examination without breaching protocol. The plan did not involve direct accusation or deviation from procedure. Instead, it focused on creating conditions under which the anomaly could be observed with greater clarity. This required precise timing, minimal disruption, and adherence to established guidelines. The next opportunity presented itself within the same operational window that had defined the pattern. The passenger appeared as expected, occupying a mid-train position consistent with previous occurrences. The inspection sequence progressed toward that location with calculated pacing. The inspector maintained outward consistency while preparing for a more detailed evaluation of the ticket. As the moment approached, the broader environment remained unchanged. Passengers continued their routines. The train maintained its schedule. No external factors indicated a shift in conditions. Yet within this controlled setting, the inspector's focus had narrowed to a single point of interaction that now carried significance beyond routine verification. The section concludes at this point of convergence. The pattern has been established, the anomaly confirmed through repetition and contradiction, and the observer's role has evolved from passive participant to active monitor. The system remains intact, but a specific element within it no longer aligns with its underlying logic. The next action, though still undefined in outcome, is now inevitable. The convergence occurred without disruption to the surrounding routine. The train maintained its schedule, and the inspection sequence progressed with the same outward consistency that had defined every prior shift. Within this continuity, the inspector approached the mid-train compartment where the recurring passenger had taken position. Timing aligned with previous observations, and the conditions required for a closer examination presented themselves without deviation from standard procedure. The ticket was presented in the same manner as before, without hesitation, without visible irregularity. Its printed information corresponded precisely to the route, the date, and the fare class expected for that segment of travel. The inspector received it with the same measured motion, yet the duration of examination extended slightly beyond routine parameters. The adjustment was minimal, calibrated to avoid attention, while allowing for a more deliberate evaluation of physical characteristics. Initial verification followed established protocol. The date was confirmed against the current schedule. The route designation aligned with the train's path. The paper exhibited the expected weight and texture of standard issuance. At this level, no discrepancy justified intervention. It was only when attention shifted to the punch mark that the previously observed inconsistency re-emerged with greater clarity. The indentation, though superficially consistent with station validation, displayed a structural irregularity under closer inspection. Its edges lacked the uniform compression typically produced by official devices. Instead, the perforation suggested controlled replication, precise enough to resemble authenticity, yet subtly divergent in depth and contour. The inspector adjusted the angle of the ticket relative to the carriage lighting, allowing shadow to reveal the internal layering of the paper. It was within this brief alteration of perspective that a secondary anomaly became visible. Beneath the surface layer, the paper exhibited a faint separation, as though two sheets had been bonded and later manipulated. The distinction was not immediately apparent under direct observation, but the shift in light exposed a thin boundary line inconsistent with standard ticket construction. This detail, combined with the irregular punch, elevated the anomaly beyond mechanical variation. The inspector maintained procedural continuity. The ticket was not withheld, nor was the passenger delayed. Instead, the examination concluded within acceptable time limits, and the document was returned without comment. The sequence moved forward, preserving the appearance of routine operation. However, the internal assessment had shifted decisively. The anomaly now indicated intentional modification rather than incidental deviation. Upon completing the carriage sequence, the inspector did not immediately escalate the matter through external channels. Instead, he documented the observation within internal railway reporting structures, adhering to protocols designed for irregular ticket detection. The report was precise, limited to verifiable details, repeated inconsistencies in punch alignment, evidence of layered paper construction, and correlation with a specific passenger profile defined by timing and route usage. No assumptions were included. The focus remained on observable facts. The report entered the administrative system as part of routine documentation, but its content triggered a secondary review process. Railway authorities, responsible for maintaining operational integrity, conducted an initial assessment of the findings. Ticket issuance logs were examined, and station validation records were cross-referenced against the reported anomalies. The analysis confirmed that no official device within the network could produce the specific characteristics described. This discrepancy extended beyond internal irregularity. The inability to match the punch signature to any authorized station introduced the possibility of external interference. Given the railway's role as a controlled transit environment, such interference fell within the scope of broader security concerns. As a result, the report was forwarded to regional authorities responsible for oversight beyond administrative boundaries. The transition from internal review to external assessment occurred without public visibility. Documentation was transferred through established channels, maintaining confidentiality and procedural integrity. The inspector's role remained unchanged in outward function, though he was notified that his observations would be subject to further inquiry. This notification did not alter his routine duties, but introduced a new dimension to the situation. The anomaly had moved beyond individual awareness into institutional recognition. The passenger continued to appear within the established pattern. Inspection proceeded as before, with no indication that the anomaly had been detected or reported. This continuity provided an opportunity for additional observation under unchanged conditions. The inspector, aware of the ongoing review, maintained his adjusted approach, ensuring that each interaction yielded as much detail as possible within procedural limits. External authorities initiated a preliminary evaluation based on the submitted report. Their analysis extended beyond ticket characteristics to include broader contextual data. Travel patterns were reconstructed using available records, mapping the passengers' appearances across multiple dates and stations. Although ticket purchases could not be directly linked due to the nature of the modifications, the timing and location of inspections provided a framework for movement analysis. The results indicated a pattern consistent with control variability. Entry points shifted within a defined segment of the route, while exit points remained concentrated within a specific corridor. This behavior suggested intentional route management designed to avoid establishing a fixed origin while maintaining a consistent destination zone. Such patterns, while not inherently unlawful, align with known methods of minimizing traceability within structured transit systems. The ticket itself became the focal point of technical analysis. A specimen obtained through routine collection procedures was subjected to detailed examination under controlled conditions. The layered construction observed by the inspector was confirmed, revealing a modified interior cavity within the paper structure. This cavity, though extremely thin, indicated a capacity for concealment of microscale material. Further analysis identified traces consistent with repeated manipulation. The internal layer had been accessed and resealed multiple times without compromising the external appearance of the ticket. The precision of this modification suggested specialized preparation rather than improvised alteration. The ticket functioned not only as proof of travel, but as a carrier medium designed to withstand routine handling without detection. At this stage, the nature of the anomaly shifted from administrative irregularity to potential evidence of covert activity. The railway system, with its predictable routes and standardized procedures, provided an ideal environment for such operations. The inspector's observations, initially limited to minor deviations, had uncovered a mechanism operating within that system without disrupting its visible function. The inspector was contacted for a formal interview. The process followed a structured format, focusing on the sequence of observations rather than interpretation. Dates, times, carriage positions, and ticket characteristics were recorded with precision. The inspector's role remained that of an observer, providing factual input without extending into investigative conclusions. His consistency in reporting reinforced the reliability of the collected data. Based on accumulated evidence, external authorities authorized a controlled escalation. The objective was not immediate intervention, but continued observation under conditions that would allow for identification of broader operational context. Surveillance measures were prepared, integrating railway coordination with external monitoring capabilities. The aim was to extend the scope of observation beyond the point of ticket inspection into the passengers' movements before and after transit. Despite these developments, the passenger remained unaware of the shift in attention. Appearances continued within the established pattern. Tickets, though modified, passed routine inspection without overt challenge. The system, from the passenger's perspective, functioned as expected. This continuity was essential to the unfolding operation, allowing observation to proceed without triggering countermeasures. The section concludes at the point where individual observation has transitioned into coordinated investigation. The inspector's role, though still grounded in routine, has become the origin of a broader inquiry that now extends beyond the train itself. The anomaly has been defined, the method identified, and the scope expanded. What remains unresolved is the purpose of the concealed material and the extent of the network supporting its movement. The transition from isolated investigation to coordinated surveillance altered the nature of the operation without changing its outward appearance. The railway line continued to function under its established schedule, and the inspector maintained his position within the system, moving from carriage to carriage with the same measured precision. What had changed was the presence of an additional layer of observation, structured, methodical, and positioned beyond the awareness of ordinary passengers. Surveillance was introduced incrementally. Rather than concentrating resources in a single location, authorities distributed observation points across multiple stations along the route. Each point operated within the constraints of routine activity, blending with existing personnel and infrastructure. Timing was synchronized with the passenger's established pattern, ensuring that coverage aligned with the narrow window in which appearances had previously been recorded. This approach minimized disruption while maximizing continuity of observation. The passenger continued to appear intermittently, adhering to the irregular schedule that had initially obscured detection. Each appearance was logged with increasing precision. Boarding locations were recorded, carriage selection noted, and exit points tracked through coordinated observation beyond the train itself. Over time, these individual data points began to form a structured timeline of movement, revealing consistency within variability. The pattern that emerged confirmed earlier assessments. Entry points shifted within a confined segment of the route, often rotating between stations with moderate passenger flow. This variability reduced the likelihood of establishing a fixed origin. In contrast, exit points remained concentrated within a defined urban corridor characterized by multiple transit connections and limited centralized oversight. The consistency of this destination zone suggested operational significance, though its exact function remained undetermined. Attention extended to the intervals between appearances. The spacing, previously understood as irregular, revealed a controlled rhythm when mapped across a broader time frame. Appearances clustered around specific days of the week and avoided predictable sequences. This spacing reduced the risk of pattern recognition while maintaining sufficient frequency to sustain ongoing activity. The balance between irregularity and repetition indicated deliberate planning rather than incidental travel behavior. Within the train, the inspector continued his role without deviation. However, his observations were now integrated into a larger reporting structure. Each interaction with the passenger was followed by a detailed account transmitted through secure channels. These reports included not only ticket characteristics, but also subtle behavioral indicators: posture during inspection, response time when presenting documents, and positioning within the carriage relative to other passengers. While none of these factors alone indicated intent, their accumulation provided a comprehensive profile. The modified tickets remained central to the operation. Additional specimens were obtained through controlled collection methods, allowing for repeated technical analysis. Each ticket exhibited the same layer construction and concealed cavity identified earlier. The consistency of this design confirmed that the tickets were not altered individually, but produced through a standardized process. This level of uniformity implied access to specialized equipment and a controlled environment for preparation. Analysis of the concealed compartments revealed traces of previous contents, though direct recovery of materials during early stages remained limited. Residual markings indicated the insertion and removal of microscale items, consistent with established methods of information transfer. The durability of the ticket structure allowed for repeated use without visible degradation, enabling the same object to function across multiple journeys. Surveillance beyond the train focused on the passenger's movements within the destination corridor. Observation teams tracked the individual from the point of exit through a sequence of short-distance transitions, platform changes, street-level movement, and entry into adjacent public spaces. These movements were characterized by efficiency and minimal deviation, suggesting familiarity with the environment. No direct contact with identifiable associates was observed during initial tracking periods. However, patterns within these movements began to reveal points of interest. The passenger consistently passed through specific locations, public seating areas, transit costs, and low-traffic corridors, where brief pauses occur without apparent purpose. These pauses, though subtle, introduce opportunities for indirect interaction with the environment. The absence of visible exchange did not eliminate the possibility of concealed activity within these intervals. To test this possibility, surveillance teams implemented controlled observation of these locations during subsequent appearances. Objects within the environment, benches, waste receptacles, and structural fixtures, were examined for signs of disturbance or modification. Initial findings were inconclusive, but repeated monitoring revealed minor alterations in specific sites following the passenger's passage. These alterations were consistent with brief physical interaction, though insufficient to confirm direct exchange. The operation advanced to a phase of active intervention. Under controlled conditions, one of the modified tickets was intercepted before completion of its full transit cycle. The passenger was detained in a manner designed to avoid public attention, and the ticket was secured as evidence. Personal effects were cataloged systematically, with each item documented and preserved according to procedural standards. The detention itself was executed without disruption to the surrounding environment, maintaining the integrity of ongoing surveillance operations. Interrogation proceeded within a structured framework, emphasizing factual reconstruction over confrontation. The individual's role was identified as that of a courier operating within a compartmentalized system. Responsibilities were limited to the transport of materials concealed within modified tickets, with no direct knowledge of the content or its broader purpose. This limitation aligned with known operational practices designed to restrict exposure within distributed networks. The method of concealment was confirmed through direct examination. The internal cavity within the ticket served as a carrier for microscale information, inserted prior to travel and removed upon arrival within the destination corridor. The passenger's task was confined to ensuring the integrity of the ticket during transit and following a predetermined route that aligned with established timing intervals. Recruitment details, obtained through structured questioning, indicated that the individual had been approached through indirect channels. Initial contact did not involve explicit identification of purpose. Instead, Participation developed gradually through a series of controlled interactions that emphasized routine tasks before introducing the transport of modified tickets. Compensation was structured to reinforce compliance without revealing the full scope of the operation. The existence of a handler was inferred through these accounts, though direct identification remained incomplete. Instructions were delivered through methods designed to avoid direct contact, prearranged signals, variations in schedule, and the use of intermediary locations within the transit corridor. The handler's position within the network appeared to be external to the immediate operational environment, reducing exposure to localized detection. Following the detention, authorities implemented a control continuation strategy. The objective was to maintain the appearance of uninterrupted operation in order to identify the handler or associated network elements. The detained individual, under supervision, replicated established patterns of movement using control materials. Surveillance coverage was expanded to capture any response to this continuation. Despite these efforts, the anticipated contact did not materialize in a direct or observable form. Indicators suggested that the network had adapted to the disruption. Scheduled appearances no longer aligned precisely with previous patterns, and environmental markers within the destination corridor showed reduced activity. The absence of direct engagement indicated either detection of the intervention or the existence of contingency protocols designed to suspend operations under uncertain conditions. The section concludes with the operation at a critical juncture. The courier has been identified and removed from independent activity. The method of concealment has been confirmed, and the structure of a network partially outlined. However, the central element, the handler responsible for coordination and oversight, remained beyond direct reach. Surveillance continues, but the system that once operated within predictable parameters has shifted into a more opaque state, preserving its core function while concealing its origin. The operation entered its final phase without any visible alteration to the railway system that had initially concealed it. Trains continued to arrive and depart on schedule. Passengers moved through compartments with the same predictable rhythm, and the inspector resumed his role within a structure that appeared unchanged. Beneath this continuity, however, the investigation had reached a point where passive observation could no longer yield additional results. The absence of the handler, despite confirmed disruption within the network, introduced a central conflict that could only be addressed through controlled exposure. Authorities designed a continuation strategy that relied on replication rather than reconstruction. The detained courier, now operating under supervision, was reintroduced into the established pattern with minimal deviation. Movement schedules were maintained within the previously observed time windows. Boarding points were selected from the same rotating set of stations. Carriage positioning remained consistent with earlier behavior. The objective was not to alter the system, but to preserve it in a form that might prompt re-engagement from the unseen coordinating element. The modified tickets, central to the operation, were reproduced under controlled conditions. Their construction mirrored the original design with exacting precision. Layered paper structure, concealed cavity, and replicated punch characteristics that aligned with the anomalous signatures previously identified. These tickets contained monitor materials, allowing authorities to track any interaction beyond the point of transit. Each stage of preparation was documented, ensuring that any deviation during the operation could be traced with accuracy. Surveillance coverage expanded beyond earlier parameters. Observation points were reinforced at stations along the route, while additional teams monitored the destination corridor with increased attention to environmental interaction. Locations previously identified as potential exchange points were subjected to continuous review. The objective was to detect not only direct contact, but also indirect indicators, changes in object placement, variations in movement patterns, or alterations in timing that might suggest observation from an external party. The first control run proceeded without incident. The courier followed the prescribed route, presented the modified ticket during inspection, and exited at the expected location. Surveillance teams maintained visual continuity throughout the process. Within the destination corridor, the individual adhered to the established sequence of movements, passing through previously identified points of interest. However, no measurable interaction occurred. Objects within the environment remained undisturbed, and no secondary presence was detected within observational range. Subsequent runs produced similar results. The system, though structurally intact, no longer generated the subtle indicators that had previously suggested active exchange. The absence of response introduced a new variable into the operation, the possibility that the network had either detected the disruption or implemented a contingency designed to suspend activity under uncertain conditions. This ambiguity complicated further action, as continued replication risked diminishing returns without increasing the likelihood of identifying a handler. Analysis shifted toward indirect indicators. Surveillance teams reviewed recorded data for anomalies that might suggest distant observation, patterns within the environment, unfamiliar individuals maintaining consistent positions, vehicles appearing across multiple locations, or timing discrepancies within unrelated activities were examined for potential connection. While isolated instances of irregularity were identified, none met the threshold required to establish a definitive link to the operation. The handler, if present, remained beyond observable range. Attention returned to the structural characteristics of the network. The compartmentalization observed during interrogation suggested that each participant operated within a limited scope of knowledge, reducing the risk of exposure in the event of disruption. The courier's role had been confined to transport, with no direct awareness of the broader system. This limitation, while effective for operational security, now constrained the investigation. Without direct contact or identifiable communication channels, the handler's position could not be isolated through conventional means. A final controlled attempt was authorized, designed to introduce a calculated variation into the established pattern. The courier's route was adjusted within acceptable margins, maintaining overall consistency while altering specific timing intervals. The intention was to test whether the network would respond to deviation by reestablishing contact or correcting the anomaly. Surveillance coverage was intensified during this phase, with particular attention directed toward transitional spaces where indirect communication might occur. The result mirrored previous outcomes. The courier completed the route without interruption. No observable response was detected within the monitored environment. The absence of engagement, despite deliberate variation, reinforced the conclusion that the network had entered a dormant or adaptive state. Whether this shift was triggered by detection of the earlier intervention or by internal protocol remained unresolved. With operational avenues narrowing, authorities initiated the process of de-escalation. Surveillance resources were gradually reduced, maintaining baseline coverage while reallocating personnel to other priorities. The controlled replication of the courier's activity was suspended, and the focus shifted toward documentation and analysis of collected data. The investigation, while incomplete, had reached a point where further action risked exposure without proportionate gain. The courier was processed through formal legal channels. Proceedings were conducted within a restrictive framework, reflecting the sensitive nature of the case. Documentation emphasized the act of unauthorized material transport without disclosing the broader operational context. Sentencing was determined based on established statutes, with limited public visibility. The individual's role, though central to discover the network, remained defined by its constrained scope. The railway system absorbed the conclusion of the operation without visible impact. Inspection procedures continued as before, though internal guidelines were revised to incorporate the lessons derived from the investigation. Greater emphasis was placed on the physical examination of tickets, particularly in relation to structural integrity and consistency of validation marks. These adjustments were implemented quietly, preserving the outward continuity of the system while enhancing its capacity for detection. The inspector returned to his routine within this updated framework. His role, unchanged in description, carried an altered significance. The initial observation, a minor inconsistency in a punch mark, had initiated a sequence of events extending beyond the boundaries of his position. Yet the system required no acknowledgement of this shift. His work continued as before, defined by repetition, precision, and attention to detail. The unresolved presence of the handler remained the defining element of the case. Evidence confirmed the existence of a coordinating figure or entity operating beyond the observed network. The absence of direct identification, despite sustained effort, underscored the limitations inherent in confronting a system designed for concealment. The network had not been dismantled entirely. It had receded, preserving its structure while eliminating its most visible component. In the final analysis, The operation demonstrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of procedural detection. A single deviation, identified within a controlled environment, had exposed a concealed method of information transfer. The system responded with precision, isolating the mechanism and interrupting its function. Yet the origin of that mechanism remained intact, beyond the reach of immediate intervention. The narrative concludes within this ambiguity. The railway continues to operate, its routines unchanged in appearance. The inspector moves to the carriages, verifying tickets that conform to expected patterns. The network, though disrupted, has not been fully revealed. Its presence is inferred through absence, its continuity suggested by the lack of closure. Within the structured predictability of the system, the possibility of unseen operations persists, embedded in the same routines that once allowed a single detail to pass unnoticed until it did not.